Fantastic. Do you know what? It's absolutely brilliant to be here. I don't usually get asked to speak at many churches on Sunday mornings, which I do lots of speaking, but I don't speak at churches on Sunday mornings very much. And you're about to find out why. It has been just so lovely to be here for the whole weekend. Thank you for having me. From the moment Miles gave me a card of welcome, I felt absolutely welcome. So thank you, Miles, and thank you all. I hope and pray that we've made some lasting connections together. We've been exploring the theme of encountering God. What better theme? And I hope we've touched on as many ways to encounter God as there have been people in the room. And more, of course. But I suppose, if we're honest, it can feel easier for us to sense God in the warmth of the summer, or at least the late summer, early autumn sunlight of a day like yesterday when we stepped out, than in the cold of winter, in the light-filled seasons of our life, rather than the darker, what I call unloved days. So this morning, prompted by Charlie, it's a little bit of a confessional, a gentle confessional, really. Not so much of an expositional. Normal service will be resumed next week. But a peek into just a slightly darker corner for a short while. Remembering that God says through Isaiah, I will give you the treasures of the darkness, riches stored in secret places, so that you may know that I am the Lord. First then, a story by a guy I've mentioned a few times this weekend, the Quaker educationist and Christian Parker J. Palmer, who's brilliant. We have to use our imagination when we come to the point of not understanding, don't we? And I'm so grateful for the creatives, the storytellers, the artists, the potters, the dancers, the singers, for helping us to step with our imagination through into God's kingdom, I suppose. There was once a man who spent too much time at the bar one night, down at the old King's Head perhaps, and was found crawling around under a streetlight by a passerby. What's going on, the passerby asks. I lost my watch, the fellow says. Well, says the passerby, I'll help you look for it. After 10 minutes, the passerby says, look, it's clear your watch is not here. Are you sure this is where you dropped it? Oh no, says the watchless man, I dropped it down the street. Then why in heaven's name are you looking for it here? Because, he said, the light is better. It's a good story, that. And as for the watch too, so perhaps for our search for God and for life itself, if we only look for God in the light, I wonder how much of God do we miss? I know from conversations I've had this weekend that some of your more profound encounters with God have come in the challenging times. Not necessarily in ways that have given you some miraculous escape route out of them, but assuredly in ways which have offered a loving presence through them. And Charlie asked me to just say one or two things about my own experience in having long COVID for quite some time, which I will just touch on for a few moments now. I've been blessed to lead quite a healthy and happy life generally. But as I said on Friday, after my wife and I caught a relatively mild dose of COVID in March 2020, we were early adopters. We didn't get better in the way we assumed we should. I was full of aches and pains, brain fog. I can blame so much on brain fog now. Fatigue. My wife couldn't draw a proper lungful of air for absolutely ages and was constantly breathless, so much so that if she tried to sing or whistle, she's a brilliant whistler. And if she would start to whistle, it could finish her off for a day or two. And it was pretty dispiriting when we had to sleep for chunks of the day, and we had 3 kids at home in lockdown, and you can imagine. And I went from being a really keen runner to not being able to walk around the block, etc., etc. And it became clear after months and then years that there was this thing called long COVID, and we had it. Mercifully, ours wasn't half as bad as many, many, many people. This isn't some kind of miraculous story. It's quite dull, actually, having it. But I have a profound appreciation now for anyone suffering from, for instance, any form of chronic fatigue, the people who are often kind of invisible. For me, it was like trying to drive with the handbrake constantly on, and it still is at times. Which is, again, dispiriting when everyone else seems to just accelerate past you, when the restrictions lifted and normal life resumed, and we all got on with rushing off again. There was a bit of irony, perhaps, as Charlie will know this, I've always given people an exercise to do when I'm doing spiritual direction one-to-one. I've asked them to take a very slow walk down a busy high street. And you might enjoy having a go, especially if you're the type of person who gets really cross when people are driving slowly in front of you. It's absolutely excruciating to start with, walking really, really slowly down a busy high street. And it's not just frustrating, but it's really embarrassing as well, if you're walking down a high street that is your own. Your mind starts saying all sorts of things. The restless, nervous, insecure ego says, what if someone sees me who I know? You look stupid. What the heck are you doing? And yet, once your mind begins to settle down a little bit and stop saying, what will people think of me, you begin to notice all sorts of things you might otherwise have missed. Had you been rushing from A to B, especially that you might have missed about somewhere so seemingly familiar. Small details you usually rush by. Sounds of conversations in doorways. Flowers growing in the cracks of the concrete pavement, and that's a beautiful metaphor in itself, by the way. Flowers growing up from the cracks in the concrete paving. People's faces. And what I've found is that a love begins to well within you for those faces instead of seeing them as people who are just in the way because you're trying to get from A to B. I had a bit of a year of it in 2021 because as well as the long COVID, I had a gangrenous ruptured appendix for which I received what they described as life-saving surgery, very grateful, as well as then ending up on crutches for several weeks to months because of a knee injury, which led to a total knee replacement. So it wasn't a great time, and I felt really quite punch-drunk by the end of it. And a lot of people very, very kindly were getting frustrated and angry even with God on my behalf. Someone said they'd been shouting at God. And there's precedent for that in the Psalms, isn't there? The Psalms link us in through that darker side to relationship with God through that pain. It's entirely biblical. The author Simone Weil says, attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. Isn't that beautiful? Attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. And I was so grateful for the loving attention of others, which is in very large part where I encountered God most tangibly during those times. But when I was asked later, looking back in a little interview that I did actually for a health website thing, When did you have your Job moment, they said, your why me God? Actually, I realized that my overriding feeling was, why not me? Since a tragedy had befallen a friend at Bible college many years ago, I realized I made a theological decision, actually, not to expect special treatment or protection from the slings and arrows of life. It just doesn't seem to work like that as a rule. But I do believe there is something richer to pursue within it all. So I asked myself instead, what is the nature of our encounter with God during the darker times? It can be hard, can't it, at any time, let alone a difficult time, to sense where God is. And I think sometimes it's when you look back that it's a little bit easier to trace God's presence with you. Charlie alluded to this on Friday night when he read the beautiful, powerful Footprints poem that most of you will know. And I'm reminded of the words of Psalm 23 in that context. Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life, which doesn't mean to say that everything is going to be all right always, but that I do believe that goodness and mercy will follow me and us, even through the valley of the shadow. They're not afraid to, because they've been that way before, haven't they? In Jesus. That means that in those times when I can't necessarily sense, where is God in this? I can take it by faith, which gives me an opportunity in faith to peer into the darkness, to let my eyes adjust instead of looking under the street lamp down the road. So, having, for myself now, just traced the path back to see where I think God might have been, I wanted to share, if that's okay with you, just one or two, actually I think it's 4 or 5, very, very brief, snippety bits of practical experience that help me now to think, okay, that's, I think, where I encountered God. So moving forward, when the darker times will come again, that's something that I might take with me into that. Don't worry, it's big print, this stuff. The old eyes, they're not quite what they used to be. So first snippety bit of encounter. I encountered God through giving thanks daily for simple blessings. I know it sounds a little bit cliched, but it's not when you read the Polish psychologist Andrew Biankowski, an eminent psychologist who was exiled as a 5-year-old with his family to Siberia after the Second World War. They lost pretty much everything. But he attributes his mental and spiritual health in life to a little saying he adopted and spoke every day from that time on to give thanks for the stuff that he had. And he said, I have life, I have breath, I have shelter, I am here. Instead of waking up and thinking about all the things we want, he says, why not start the day remembering what we already have? If we're in a position to take anything for granted, we're probably already blessed, he says, beyond our needs. Second, I encountered God in the intimacy of not knowing. The not knowing that we heard about this morning, in a sense. The grief expert Francis Weller, who writes from a Christian perspective, quotes a Zen saying that not knowing can be most intimate. At the start of 2020, I had a wall planner. Yes, I had a wall planner on my wall. And for the first time in my life, as a freelancer, self-employed Christian something or other, that wall planner was filled all the way through 12 months. I knew where I was going. I was so excited about it. I used to bring people in to show them. And within 2 months, March 2020, it was all ripped up with COVID, as it was for all of you, for your wall planners too. There's a certain sense of trust, of falling back into the arms of God, is there not? When we don't know what's what anymore. An intimacy that we might never experience if we've got it all planned out all the time for ourselves. The Orthodox Christians have a saying, our suffering can bring us closer to God, so long as we bring our suffering to God. An intimacy in not knowing. Then there's a form of contemplative prayer. I've spoken about contemplative prayer and practice a lot this weekend. There's a form of prayer called welcoming prayer. And all you do is sit and become aware of any feelings arising within your body quietly. And instead of trying to do battle with them and banish them, you gently welcome them instead, which is extremely countercultural. You're not welcoming the diagnosis or the sudden change in circumstances, but the feelings that arise within you, however difficult they may be. And you sit with them for as long as you want. And finally, you can, yes, too, hand them over into the love of God. This prayer helped me more than anything to shift from brace to embrace. And as we begin to embrace with love the place we're in, don't we begin to sense that embrace of God within it? Fourth, I've encountered God in the example and wisdom of those who have gone before, especially in the example of people who have learned to face into their own situation instead of trying to get round it or underneath it or magically over it or whatever. And in doing so, somehow exude that certain depth and wisdom that is so winsome. You'll know someone who's done it. And I thank God so much for them because they lead by example through their being. And then there are saints who have gone before as well, who have left us with their wisdom that still just resonates for today. The 12th century German nun Hildegard of Bingen gifted us a powerful metaphor about wholeness, which made such sense for me at the time. Like a bird, she says, we fly with 2 wings of awareness. The one wing is an awareness of life's glory and beauty. The other is an awareness of life's pain and suffering. If we try to fly with only one of these wings, she says, we'll be like an eagle trying to fly with only one wing. A good picture. And finally, I encountered God in simple practices. Talked about packing a suitcase for a place none of us has been, a place that has to be believed to be seen, and what would we put in that suitcase? And I would put just a handful of practices as well as curiosity and wonder and openness and love. But simple practices that help me to try to stay true. Not always, but I see that these help me through the more difficult times. You might well remember the lessons you learnt from COVID, from the days when it was hardest for you. I know it's not always nice returning to thinking about COVID, but I don't think we've captured the half of actually what we might have learnt and experienced that we can take with us into the future. I remember hearing advice from Terry Waite early on. Terry Waite, who had been the Archbishop of Canterbury's envoy and famously held hostage in, was it Libya? Or Lebanon. Interesting guy to speak to at that time. He said, make the bed and get dressed for the day. It's about all he could do, in a sense. And sometimes that was about all we could do. But that in itself is a spiritual practice when we remember that this too is the day that the Lord has made. And we can still approach this otherwise unloved day with love in God's grace and bring love to it. In a sense, our collective COVID moment was a time to put all our years of spiritual practice into practice. Yeah? And to find, I hope, that we can continue to do so, even if it sometimes means we can only take it day by day or step by step. Henri Nouwen, the great Henri Nouwen, said that God tends to give us only enough light for the next step, even if sometimes we can only take it breath by breath. God is nowhere. God is now here. Breathe in. Make the space. Whenever we practice God's presence intentionally, as Brother Lawrence called it, you remember Brother Lawrence, as a monk, he famously tried to do the smallest things with great love, things that he did not enjoy, like the washing up in the kitchens of his monastery. As we practice God's presence, then I think we help to bring God's transforming presence to the world around us. I remember the second wave of the pandemic arriving just as autumn and winter loomed, this time 2 years ago. Time flies. I wonder how you were feeling at the time. I remember I led some live online sessions where we practiced stepping outside at twilight together, dispersed, to pause and specifically to face into the gathering darkness with courage and love. To let our eyes adjust and let the eyes of our heart adjust as we did so. And we would recite that wonderful line from Psalm 74. Yours is the day, Lord, yours also the night. Yours is the summer, Lord. Yours also the winter. Yours is the day. Yours also the night. It makes me almost want to cry just to think about that line and how that sustained me. I began to cultivate a compass point prayer, just using the points of the compass each morning as a practice, which could take me through the passage of one sort of unloved groundhog kind of day, just one day, bringing hope to me and helping, I hope, to bring hope to the day itself. And it's something that I'm still trying to do. So at the start of the day, let me just give you this for free. I face east to the point of sunrise, and I'll use a line of a prayer such as a scripture, create in me a clean heart. Like breathe it in and breathe it out, a prayer of penitence, because every single day brings with it the chance to start again with God. And then I'll face south to point to the place at midday at noon where I know the sun will be at its highest, even if it's behind cloud. And that we can remember to soak in the light of God's love wherever we find ourselves. And then facing west to the direction of sunset, I try to face in at that moment to the place of mystery and not knowing and intimacy. I remember Jesus getting on his knees at Golgotha in his greatest time of fear and not knowing and saying, your kingdom come, your will be done. Your will be done, Lord. And facing north into the darkness, yours is the day, Lord, yours also the night. And if I remembered, I would step outside to see the pole star, remembering that actually in the deepest darkness, there is one point of reference that we can hold to. For me, it was that nothing can separate me from the love of God. And the glorious truth is that because of the darkest night Jesus traveled through, we can now turn again through the night time to a new dawn. Then came the morning that sealed the promise we've just sung. I love Tess Ward's words from the autumn invocation we used during yesterday's outdoor session. Embracer of all, who stretched out your hand to join up the circle of life. The circle is joined so that, in my little prayer at least, I can turn back to the east, to the place of sunrise again, where the sun will rise with healing in its wings, according to Malachi. Where your mercies are new every morning, as it says in the book of Lamentations, which was written with faith and vision from within a very, very dark time in Israel's history. From an alternative perspective too, the rhythm of the day, the Hebrew way of seeing it kind of gives us another tiny twist as well. From the book of Genesis, we learned that day follows night. There was evening and there was morning, the first day. We pass through the dark to get to the light, as if being born. Perhaps the hardest point of encounter with God is in the letting go of all that we have held to dearly and tightly. Our wall planner, our relationships, our success, our health, our very life in the end. Because that letting go seems necessarily to take us into darkness first, but into a richer darkness than we could ever have imagined. Because there's always a poetic twist in God's kingdom, isn't there? I think that's why I trust it so much. And as the Christian writer Christine Kane says, sometimes when you think you've been buried, it's a planting. Life was never about getting ahead anyway, was it? All this dashing around that we do. The Bible says it's more about fruitfulness, which is appropriate for this time of year, harvest. Love, joy, patience, peace, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control, cultivated inwardly, expressed outwardly. It all starts with a seed, doesn't it? And the shiny shell of our life, perhaps beginning to crack open somewhere, somehow in darkness. Transformation is a mysterious thing, but what a calling to be first fruits of the Creator's new creation bursting into life. We have to use our imagination at this point. So let me finish as I started with one very short story. This time by the Christian contemplative Cynthia Bourgeault, and it's appropriate for autumn. Once upon a time, this is called acornology. So you might like to imagine you are sitting, as some of you did yesterday, beneath a beautiful tree, and actually it's an oak tree. Once upon a time, in a not so far away land, there was a kingdom of acorns nestled at the foot of a grand old oak tree. Since the citizens of this kingdom were modern, fully westernized acorns, they went about their business with purposeful energy. And since they were midlife, baby boomer acorns, this was written probably 20 years ago now, so they engaged in a lot of self-help courses. There were seminars called Getting All You Can Out of Your Shell. There were woundedness and recovery groups for acorns who had been bruised from the original fall from the tree. There were spas and for oiling, and polishing those shells, and various acornopathic therapies to enhance longevity and well-being. One day, in the midst of this kingdom, there suddenly appeared a knotty little stranger, apparently dropped out of the blue by a passing bird. He was capless and dirty, making an immediate negative impression on his fellow acorns. And crouched beneath the oak tree, he stammered out a wild tale. Pointing upwards at the tree, he said, "We are that." delusional thinking, obviously, the other acorns concluded, but one of them continued to engage him in conversation anyway. So tell us, how would we become that tree? Well, said he, pointing downwards, it has something to do with going into the ground and cracking open the shell. Insane, they responded. Totally morbid. Why? Then we wouldn't be acorns anymore. Yours is the day, Lord. Yours also the night. Embracer of all. Can I just finish Tess Ward's Autumn Invocation, which I read half of yesterday as a blessing? Embolden me as I sit in the silence and let you be the all in all, we finished at. For in the pounding of the grain is the sharing of the bread. In the crushing of the grape is the pouring of the wine. In the falling of the leaves is the feeding of the roots. In the cutting of the corn is the new seed that will rise again. In the dying time and darkness is your promise of hope renewed. For you have lain in the deathly grip and felt the power of love's release. Release in me the power of love as I set out from here. Release in us your love. Amen.